My name's Terry, and I live in Glasgow. I'm early 60s, and for the last 25, 30 years now, I've worked in HR, human resources. Um, Quite a captured profession, unfortunately. My peaking story is it, I come across trans identifying people in the course of work a few times over my career, over the years. Um, had to handle questions like at work, trans identifying male, when can I start using the ladies? Those sort of issues, having discussions at work about how to handle that. Hadn't really given it an awful lot of thought. Um, and it was my wee sister who picked me. She was involved much earlier. She was on Mumsnet because I don't have children. I wasn't on Mumsnet particularly, so I didn't come across it there. But she was on Mumsnet. That definitely was where her peaking came from. But she was there for then my peak person. And I can remember her saying to me, "Have you thought about what do you think about this?" Talking around the topic, and I think at the time I can remember saying something like, "Well, just be kind," and very much having that sort of approach, and her getting quite irate with me, which isn't infrequent that she gets irate with me, but not usually over a big topic like this. I could tell she was getting irate. Um, and she was obviously put out that I didn't get it. Um, so we talked a little bit more about it, and she basically sent me away to educate myself, do some thinking, and she sent me some bits and pieces to have a read. There's a few different things she'd sent me to read. One was, I think, about Castor Semenya. Not even sure I'm pronouncing his name right. One was about, in quotes, Karen White. But one of them was about Philip Bunce, who worked for Credit Suisse. And the bit that his story was the one that got me. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So then everything else, you begin to see it everywhere. But it's one of those things where at the time, I almost felt really guilty that it was something as relative, and by comparison, relatively mild. A man choosing to be known as a woman at work, everybody was fully clothed. There's no, it wasn't like a rape crisis center or a prison where there's no escape. Those weren't the stories that piqued me. So I felt at first guilty that a normal work situation, and Philip Bunce, or Pips Bunce as he preferred to be known, certain days of the week, was my peaking story. But actually, thinking about it, in part reflecting on it, knowing you wanted to talk to me, I was like, well, but why was it something as relatively comparative compared to prisons and rape crisis centres and domestic refuges and so on? It's relatively neutral by comparison with those sort of situations. Why was that the one that got me? And I think it was because it was personal, because he was given an award by Women in Banking and Finance as an organisation. I had been a member for several years of Women in Banking and Finance because I used to work for a bank based in Scotland. And we were encouraged actively to join Women in Banking and Finance. And I'd find them very supportive and their meetings really interesting. They had always interesting speakers. And they really were about recognising how, like many industries, banking was very male dominated and very macho in many respects. And when you start working up the ranks, add to that, as with so many professions, the difficulties once women take time out for pregnancy, childcare, and so on. But banking was very macho, male dominated, and very misogynistic. And very much more difficult for women to break into. And Women in Banking Finance had been a fabulous organisation for me. I'd moved away from banking by the time I was peaked, but I'd been a member of theirs for quite some time. So it really shocked me that an organization that I thought I knew well would not just support, but give a woman's award to a man who, by his own admission, part-time, I mean, I want to say by his own admission he was a part-time cross-dresser. I don't think he necessarily described himself as a cross-dresser, but he acknowledged publicly that he was part-time. Sometimes he wanted to be Pip's Bunce, sometimes he wanted to be Philip Bunce, and he chose what he was going to be each day, depending on how he felt. And that just seemed so ludicrous that but it was also so personal for me, because it wasn't an organization I'd worked for, but I knew the industry, and I'd worked as a member with Women in Banking and Finance. It just seemed so wildly ludicrous that they could give an award to a part-time man who claimed to be a part-time woman. I mean, it was just so mad. And as I said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So once one bit piques you, you then see it everywhere. And I then started to think more about, well, but what does that mean for women in domestic refuge centres? And what does it mean for a woman in prison? And you really start to dig into it. And that's when the full horror starts to hit. But I think the peaking takes a personal touch. There's got to be something that makes it personal for you in peaking, I think. But then you see it everywhere, and you can't unsee it. Then you start to dig into it, and you start to recognize the horror for women who are as vulnerable as women in prisons or domestic refuge centres, rape crisis centres, and so on. There's always that balance, probably more so for women involved in this than there would be if it was men involved, of having to try and keep a balance between your own personal and or family lives and what we want to do in terms of being involved in wider groups. But it was during 2018 that I started to become much more active, seeking out meetings to go to, seeking out people to meet, and seeking out ways of getting out to talk to more women about it, to learn more about it. And it's kind of just all developed from there, really. My wee sister, who picked me. It really wasn't that difficult. One conversation, then sending me off to read some bits, but she was very pleased. And it's for both of us. We both are just so aware. It's just so nice to have someone you can just talk to about it. And we'll often pick up the phone to each other just to go, have you seen? Ah! And or constantly WhatsApping each other, saying, have you seen this? Did you say that? And so said this. So it's just so nice to have someone that you can just be completely open with, and not worry about what you say to them. And I think for both of us, we're both still the first person would pick up the phone to if something happened or something was going on that gave us the rage or whatever, or just wanted to go. Like after the Supreme Court ruling last year now, April, first thing we did was message each other. It was so exciting to see that. But yeah, she was very happy indeed to see me, A, getting it, and B, getting involved, and then C, taking action for myself as well. So because I've become a lot more active over the years, and just glad to find ways that I can contribute to this. So she was involved very, very early on in CAN-SG, the Clinical Advisory Network for Sex and Gender. And when she told me what they were planning with that, it did make me think, because by then I'd been involved with Scottish Feminist Network. I'd set up one of their regional groups, was quite involved with them. And I'd also got involved as a member of Women's Rights Network in Scotland. And it was nice having those sort of groups, and stalls were being run, and street stalls to talk to the general public. Really enjoyed doing those. So there were things that we were starting to do, but it also was making me question, where can I make a contribution that feels meaningful to me? Because for a lot of what I was doing at that stage, it was just, well, anybody else could have done exactly what I was doing. I wasn't contributing anything extra, if you like. It could have been any 15 people or 10 people or however many ran a street stall and talked to people. I don't think I would have been any better or worse at talking to the general public than anybody else on the stands and the stalls that when we ran them, those sort of situations. So it did start me thinking, well, she's doing this, and that's sort of her niche where she can make a different contribution, a real extra contribution. I wonder what mine could be, and not really knowing what or how I could do it. But then there was a new group started in Glasgow Tactical Feminists, and that was great. And I did for a while wonder, maybe this could be my thing. Maybe this would be something that would help me get more engaged, do more activism that was more proactive for me. But again, I still came back to thinking, I'm not doing anything that anybody else couldn't step in and pick it up. So I'm not adding value more than any other person would add. But because I work in HR, when it affects people in the workplace, it feels particularly wrong and unjust for me, which is why I think this Philip Bunce character was my peaking, because it personalized it for me. I could see the impact in the workplace. And it was Maya Forstater's first tribunal. So not when she went to appeal, but when she first went to tribunal, and she lost. I honestly couldn't believe that she lost. But I had a niggle. I can remember talking to a couple of my sister's friends. I didn't know an awful lot of women in Scotland at that time engaged in this, but I remember talking to one of my sister's friends, and her saying, "Oh, Maya's got to win this. This is clear cut. This is an absolute easy one. She's got to win this." And I can remember saying to her, "I just have this little niggle that they're going to use what they did use about not being worthy of respect. But I just have this niggle that they might, if it goes the wrong way, it'll be because of that." And unfortunately, I was proved right. But I also remember saying to my sister's friend, "But for all it will be painful for Maya if she does lose, what it means is she'll set precedent when I hope she then goes forward and wins at appeal tribunal," which of course ultimately it did. But I know how difficult it is and how much emotionally and financially is involved in going through tribunal. In my job as HR, I'd supported employers, my organizations I'd worked with, going through tribunal from that side. And even for them, where they're the respondent, it's painful, it's emotionally draining, and it's an enormous amount of work to go to tribunal. So what these women like Maya would go through when they're the claimant must be 10 times worse. So I really felt the unjustness of that. And for me, I mean, I'm in HR always someone who goes back to source data. So if anyone had questions about what's the rights and wrongs of doing this, or should we take this approach, or should we take that approach, I'll go back to the written legislation, and I'll go back and I'll read the legislation. So I knew the Equality Act pretty well as it applies to the workplace. I wouldn't say I could quote you excerpts from it or tell you exactly where to find things, but I knew the sort of language and wording that was used in it. And I know that the supporting notes for it made it so blasted clear that single-sex spaces could be protected for women only, for example, even if it was a trans-identifying man claiming it to be a trans woman who was wanting to access them. So this, although the Equality Act was neutral in its language, the supporting notes, which aren't legally binding, were clear. So I couldn't believe that that Maya lost her tribunal at first. And I can remember after the day where the result came out, starting to put shout outs on Twitter, as it was then, saying, not all HR people are stupid like this, and not all HR people are this mad and bonkers about this subject. And if there's anybody else out there, get in touch. Please, I can't be alone. Please tell me I'm not alone. And very quickly, we had quite a nice little group of women talking and chatting and saying, we all work in HR, and God, this is mad. And at first, it just began to feel these are kind of my people. This is helping me feel that we can do something different, and at least I've got different people to talk to about this. It's not just talking to the general public on the street. It's something that's a bit different. We're talking as a profession. And that grew over the years, and we started to get bigger and have a few more people getting involved. And we decided we wanted to kind of launch as an organization of some sort, as a sort of network where we would encourage people to come and talk to us and join us. Very much based on sex realist or gender critical views, but with a very specific tie back to the HR profession and what it meant for us as HR professionals being sex realist. And it was actually Maya at Filia got in touch. We had some really good conversations. She has always been extremely supportive, and I remember her first message to me was, I see you're looking to collect HR people. So am I. Shall we talk? And she's been really supportive of us as a group generally, and since then as we've launched. But she also suggested that we contact the Civil Service Scene Network. So I know someone who was a member of theirs in Scotland, said, would you mind connecting me? Had a couple of conversations with different people there. And we were sort of toing and froing backwards and forwards talking about this, and saying they were sharing how they set up as a workplace network. And by that time there was Scene in the City. And when we saw them launch, I went back to the Civil Service Scene Network and said, we're thinking of doing a launch, but we'd quite like to call ourselves Scene in HR, but how would you feel about us using the Scene name? And they came back and said, would be overjoyed, would be very proud if you did. So a few weeks later, we launched as Scene in HR. And I feel that it's somewhere that, as a group, we have added value that somebody else might not have done, might not have been able to do. We've been able to challenge our professional body. It is just a professional body rather than a regulatory body. But we've been able to challenge them very directly. We've had several meetings with them, which have been very constructive. And they've taken a number of actions as a direct result of conversations with us. I'm sure we're not the only people they've been talking to. But early on, I do remember a couple of comments came back from them about, yes, we're talking to a number of different people on this subject, but it's really important we hear from our own members. So I think our voice held some extra weight with them because we were senior HR professionals. And I feel that as a group, we've been able to really add value to and make changes, have a real impact on the HR professional space, at least in terms of the information and guidance that our professional body is now sharing. It's taken time, it's taken a lot of work, but I do feel we've been able to really add value and make a difference there, that in a way that I couldn't have done by just being a member of another organization. And that's been really satisfying. But for me, I think one of the biggest outcomes is I love that we've been able to add value and make a difference, not just by being another body, but by dint of what we do. But also, it's just given me so much broader connections in the women's and feminist movement generally. And not just with my fellow HR professionals, but across all the different women's organizations that I've worked with or been engaged with, like Women Won't Wheesht. They're not a membership group as such, but I've been very supportive of them and working with them, with For Women Scotland, with MBM, across the whole feminist movement, especially in Scotland. Made some really strong and lasting friendships out of that, which, if I hadn't got engaged in this, just would never have happened. And I know I'm not alone in saying this, but so often through this, I've met people whose paths would probably have never crossed with me before. But actually, I would not want not to be in my life now. I think it's reminded me to approach difficult subjects thinking critically, because it's so easy, especially when you get past midlife into later midlife. Don't want to admit to being anything other than, I'm not going to admit to being older life or anything like that, but I think once you get past your 40s, possibly, it's easy to coast along and just accept your views for what they are without actually stopping to think why. Too easy often. And I think it's really good to be challenged or challenge yourself on, well, I've always assumed this, and therefore I've assumed that that's okay and that's right. But are my assumptions correct? So it's because I started from that position on sex realism. It was like, but why? Why not just be kind? Then you dig into it, you learn more, and you realize why, and you can actually get into understanding and approaching it with a different thought process. But it means I can apply that critical thinking process to other tricky subjects in a way that I probably just have coasted along accepting my assumptions were okay before. So it's changed how I approach difficult topics. It's still left me feeling completely rudderless politically. Don't know which way to turn in terms of political parties. I've never been a particularly strong political person. Never been involved in politics as such at all, but it has left me feeling that there's nowhere to turn politically. Whereas before I would always have said, oh, I knew exactly who I was going to vote for, which party I wanted to support or vote for, even if I wasn't active with it. I wouldn't have a clue where to start now, frankly. I find it truly mind-boggling that HR professionals, not just people who dabble or think they're do a little bit of HR on the side, but actual properly qualified HR professionals get this so wrong. But I think so few of them, I think there's two things. Take a step back from there. There's two things. I did a master's in HR management a number of years ago, but as a mature student. And one of the reasons I chose the course that I did was because you had to have had a couple of years at least of work experience before they would let you onto the course. And I thought, well, actually, that's good. You're not getting people who are coming straight out of a bachelor, straight into doing a master's without any work experience. And I think to get to that next level in HR professionally, you need to have had that work experience to be able to work out how to apply the theory. So I thought, that's fine. This is the course that will work for me because it will be likely more mature students, or at the very least people with good work experience. What I didn't bank on was that the work experience that some of them had was 2 years in a Saturday job. Sweeping the floor in a hairdresser, which, don't get me wrong, it's a job that's important. People have to do it. You still have to learn how to work in a workplace and with people and all the rest of it, but it doesn't really contribute to HR professional work. And really, the work experience was next to meaningful, next to meaningless, rather. And there was, they got so bogged down in the theory and didn't have examples. So when it came to assignments that we had to do, they didn't have any real work experience in HR or even in management to be able to apply it to. So they didn't actually know what they were doing. So they got stuck in the theory without moving on. And I think it needs that combination of critical thinking and real life experience. The way you put those two together is what makes a master's meaningful, I think. And they missed too much of that. So they got bogged down in theory and didn't get beyond that. And I think there's people coming out with high qualifications in HR who've been through something like that master's. And that was, I thought, one of the better ones. But people come out with an HR qualification and expect to go into a management level HR job. So not starting at the bottom, but expecting to go into a management level HR job without any real life experience of it and only the theory. Lots of theory, but only the theory, with no knowledge of how to put it into practice at all. And I think that's dangerous. I think the other side of it is that too few HR people actually go back and look at the legislation. And one of the realizations I had around that was somebody put a post on LinkedIn. There's a number of, I don't just follow HR people, I'm followed by HR people on LinkedIn. It's quite broad business, senior management and so on that I follow. I like to get a mixed set of views. But someone from the HR community had posted a question on LinkedIn, and it was, answer in the comments, please. If your organization or an organization you support asks for a new policy that they don't have, where do you start? What are the key steps you look at? And I don't often reply, and I really don't post much on LinkedIn, but I went back and I had a look and I thought, I'm going to say something on this one, because you start with what the legislation requires of you. Then you look at what the organisation does or doesn't want to do or can and can't afford to do. Then you also need to talk to the people that will impact, the unions if you've got them, and work at what, having filtered through what the law requires, what the organisation wants and can afford. Then you bring that extra level in to say, well, here's our parameters. Now we want to hear from you as well. And I didn't expect that to be an unusual comment. It was wildly unusual. Almost everybody else was saying, oh, I would start by going out and consulting with our employees on this and employees on that and the union on the next thing. And I just thought, but you need to start with what the law does and doesn't allow you to do first, surely. And I can remember going back and posting a couple of replies to saying, but why wouldn't you check the legislation first? Why wouldn't you then also see what your company can or can't afford to do? And people going, no, that's not important. What's important is we listen to our people. We want people to be happy at work. We want people to feel engaged in all of this. But for me, that's totally the wrong way around. It's not that I don't want people to feel engaged or be happy with the outcome, but you've got to stay within what the law does and doesn't want you to do and what the company can and can't afford to do. So the engaging with the people has to come after complying with the law. And that seemed to be an extremely unusual view. And again, for me, there's a bit of a lack of critical thought when you get to that place. So I would always have started with, I'll go back to the Equality Act and read it again. I'll go back and see what the supporting notes suggest. How would I interpret that for where I am? Maybe double check it with an employment lawyer, but not always. But everybody else seemed to start with what will keep employees happy. And I still can't get my head around why you wouldn't start with what the law requires. But I think that's a lot of what's led. I don't quite know why HR have ended up there, but I think in a kind of roundabout way, I'm saying, even when people go through good qualifications like masters in HR, it doesn't necessarily help them get to that place. And an awful lot of people never take any qualifications in HR, but land in HR. So there's not that challenge to your thinking, that rigor of going back to what legislation does and doesn't require of you. There's nothing about that compliance for an organisation that's being supported by HR that makes them even think anything other than keep the people happy, keep the employees happy, irrespective of what the law says you should or shouldn't do. So I do think there's a bit of a lack of critical thinking from HR, well qualified people, far less people who haven't got the qualifications or haven't had the experience. So the natural move seems to be to go to, well, what will keep people happy, which of course is being affirming and letting people choose the gendered toilets of their preference rather than actually stopping to think, does this comply with the health and safety regulations 1992? Does that actually mean that we're potentially discriminating against women by doing that? And there's not that critical thought process there. And it weirdly does seem to be particularly prevalent in HR. I think, don't necessarily any more prevalent in HR, but I think in so many organizations, HR aren't the decision makers on policy, but we're the gatekeepers of policy. So an organization will say, I think we need a policy on this, or HR might say, board, we think you should be thinking about a policy like this. HR will put that together and be the gatekeeper and suggest or recommend things, and then take it back to the senior management or the board or whoever and there should be HR, not always, but in many cases is HR on the board. So they're one of the decision makers sometimes, but the board or senior management team tend to be the decision makers, which may or may not include HR. But we're the gatekeepers in terms of they expect us to put forward something that's going to keep them compliant with the law and not have them falling foul of potential future tribunal claims. And that connection's been lost. But I think HR is seen as worse because we're the gatekeepers of policy, but I don't necessarily think we're any worse than any other business profession. It just, our impact is higher because we're so often the gatekeepers of policy. When you're working, as opposed to retired or a student or whatever, and I've never actually looked into the reality of this, but I've always heard it said that you spend more of your waking hours with work colleagues than you do with waking hours than you do with your partner or family, because you've got so much time at work, and especially within the UK, the long hours culture that so many businesses seem to have. I can't see anything that would challenge that. So you spend so much time of your waking hours at work that it has a huge impact on how you think about life generally, what happens at work. But I think the other side of it that's maybe had an impact on HR is EDI, DEI, however you want to describe it, has grown over the last 10 or so years, in the UK particularly. And I've worked with HR in many, many, many different countries. And I would always have said, and still would say, diversity and inclusion means something different in almost every country. So in America, it's much more about, are you black or brown or white? That's where their focus on EDI, DEI, whatever is rather than anything else. In Germany, I did work with several different companies in Germany. In Germany, I got the impression that there was a lot more focus on potential discrimination between people who originated from East Germany versus West Germany. I can remember being away for work, I can't remember which city it was in, with one of my German colleagues, an HR colleague, and them saying to me, making some comment over dinner about those Osties, and me not getting it, saying, what? And he was referring to people he believed from East Germany, and how country bumpkinish they were in the big city. And I can remember being really taken aback at the time, but just a different country, different culture. Their focus was less on, are you black, brown or white, where it is in America, and was more on differences like that. Not that it would be exclusively that, but those sort of differences. But also then if you look to other parts of, I was going to say Germany again, but other parts of Europe even. I worked with companies in Czech Republic, it is completely acceptable, normal, appropriate in their eyes to comment on a woman's looks in the workplace. And the women don't seem to have a problem with it and say, it's normal, it's fine, which I found very odd. But in Hungary, they looked at different things again. And some Western European countries that are further towards the East, they look at the Eastern European countries and how, whether they're discriminating or not against them. So I think every country and every culture has a different sort of primary focus of EDI, DEI. And I think at the moment, for the last 5 or so years in the UK, and actually I would say actually probably longer than that, I think in the UK, our focus on diversity has probably been more around sex, men v women. And of course that has developed over the last 7-ish, whatever, 7-8 years in particular, to my knowledge, that I've been involved with. That's developed more into women's rights versus trans rights. But I think sex has been the, are we inclusive or not, are we discriminating or not, question in the UK for a long time as our primary focus. Definitely not the only one, but as a primary focus. I think that's probably what's led to such a strong vocal feminist movement and women's movement in the UK, is because men versus women in terms of parity of opportunity and pay and so on has been a big focus for the UK for so long, that it's probably what's made so many women so much more vocal and led to us being called TERF Island, where other countries, it's not that it's not important, but it's not been the primary DEI, EDI focus. But I think also in the UK, in Scotland in particular, SNP's bonkers self-ID galvanised women so much, and we're small enough as a country and with so much of the population in Central Belt that it was actually quite easy to mobilise women and to be very vocal with our fight back. And that's spreading across the UK. But it's not that it started with us, it didn't, but I think it made it easier for us to be louder, more cohesive, sooner in Scotland, because the SNP gave us that focus. But I think, and again, I've never been politically active, as in party political, but certainly the women who wouldn't wheesht book and the women behind all of, well, not just the women behind that, but women in Scotland especially, there was a core group who come out of the independence movement where they were told, wheesht for Indy. Nothing matters except independence. Ignore anything else that you might disagree on, and wheesht for Indy, as in support, independence support, all together on this single topic. And actually what women have done since is, irrespective of our political backgrounds, we've worked together because we won't wheesht. We won't be silenced, but it's galvanized us and brought us together stronger in spite of, or almost because of, what the SNP did, but definitely in spite of. And I think that's been really powerful. We grew as a network, and I'm not meaning a specific named group, but just as a coalition of women working together and building and being vocal and so on. That grew exponentially, I think, when the GRR bill was being talked about, when the SNP started really pushing that. So it went from being small secretive meetings to being big secretive meetings to being out in the streets relatively quickly. And it also went from being a small handful of women at meetings and groups to huge gatherings. So I think SNP and their GRR bill helped things to grow really fast, really strongly. And it meant there was so many more people involved that you could achieve more as a result of that. So definitely, I don't think they realised the power they were giving women when they pushed that GRR bill, and how we would respond, and we won't take no for an answer. And it really galvanised action from so many women, because it just was so ridiculous what they were trying to push. Not the idea behind it, but the way it was going to work and the impact on women was so ludicrous. I don't think that, I mean, there's other ways they could have tried to achieve the same aim that would not have galvanized us the way it did. But the way that they went for it with formal legislation, it completely galvanized Scottish women into action. And I don't think we'd have been as vocal or as strong or as cohesive if they hadn't done that. You still get pushback from some of the big, like Let Women Speak events and so on. There's always going to be pushback. There's always going to be protesters, people coming to protest against us. They would say they're counter-protesters, but that would mean that we're protesting. We're not, we're just talking. But there's always going to be protesters against big events like that. But actually, on a not infrequent basis, women can get together, hire a meeting room, or go to a pub. Might be careful which pub we choose or what place we choose to go for a meeting room, but it's not seen as unusual for women to get together and meet and sit and talk about this now. And those sort of meetings, 7-8 years ago, would have had the activists hunting us down and, as happened to some of the women in England, attacking us. Or as it happened in Aberdeen. Somebody was attacked at a Women Won't Waste event, one of the organisers. But that's less common now. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, I'm sure it does, and they're very intimidating if they do come along to protest. But we can get together in groups and just talk openly. So we might still be cautious what pubs we pick or what places we choose to get a meeting room, but we can do that without the same worry at all now. So things have moved on, things have progressed a lot in the last 6-7 years. You get to know some places that are definitely not worth asking, and some places that are probably at best neutral but are okay and will be fine with letting you rent a room from them or hire a space from them. But I think it's still, I know more and more women are speaking up, not anonymously. I am still professionally neutral and anonymous on this. And when I post anything about this online, I don't use my full name at all. Because for so many of us, it still has a potential impact on access to work. And I'm not in a position to retire yet, so I still need to have work. And I still choose to remain professionally neutral and quiet and silent and be silenced to an extent in order to keep putting food on the table, paying my bills. And it shouldn't be like that. I don't think it's as bad as it was, but it's still quite a big decision. If you're vocal, publicly vocal, it's a big decision to say that in a professional arena. And it still has a potentially huge impact. I know for myself, there have been contracts where I've been shortlisted and or been offered if the contracts come round to actually needing filled, that had I been public with my views on this, I would never even have made the long list, far less been on the short list or offered the work, because of who some of the organisations are that I've worked with. Having these views don't stop me doing a good job in HR, because, and again, it comes back to what I said, for me, and it's one of those things, if I think back to earlier years working in HR, and I've not always worked in HR, I was a manager, people manager before, team leader and team manager, before I moved into HR. But from early days in HR, one of my objectives on a performance contract was always no advice I gave could lead to or should lead to any successful tribunals against the organisation. So people could still land us in a tribunal, but so long as that we didn't lose it as a direct result of advice I'd given, that was okay. But if it was because I'd given poor advice, then I'd failed on a performance contract. And that was always one of the HR 101, if you like, that be compliant, keep your organisation compliant. From there on in, there's a whole scope of how you can do HR. And keeping an organisation compliant and following what the law says is just such an important part of it that just gets missed too often. The police aren't good at being very neutral in policing these sort of protests against women's meetings, like for example, Let Women Speak. And if I think back to, can't remember what year it was now, but the first Let Women Speak event in Glasgow, the police were engaged with well. The police listened well, which they don't always do. And although there were a lot of very vocal, very noisy protesters who were quite aggressive, and some of them mingled with the crowd at the Let Women Speak event and caused some trouble, but by and large, the police kept them separate. There was an awful lot of them, of the people protesting against us, that would have their faces covered, would wear balaclavas, sunglasses, baseball caps, and they would be dressed in all in black. That is intimidating. I can remember there was talk at the time of making sure that no woman arrived on her own. So anyone who was coming along could be met at one of the major stations or the bus station or whatever, and they would come together in a group in case, because they were worried of those sort of physical attacks or aggression, if not direct physical attacks. So there was always that aggression and potential for physical violence, but on those occasions the police kept them separate enough that it never actually transpired into anything as direct as what happened at those meetings in England. And I've never experienced anything as direct as they did. And even more recently, one of the quite shocking protests for me was the one at a CAN SG conference down in England. Was it London? I think. Anyway, I think it was in London. But that was pretty shocking because things have moved on so much that the activists don't tend to be able to get close enough to behave like that. But even that, the people who were attending the conference, and I won't say women because it was men as well, but the people attending the conference were in the conference rooms, as far as I can gather, 2 or 3 floors away from the entrance. There were some people, and there was security, of course, down at the entrance area. But it was a much more limited impact, even when the protest was and the attack was as direct and as violent as that was. There was still a degree of separation from the majority of the event, unlike the, I think it was a Women's Place event. It was so much more direct. And anyone and everyone there couldn't not have been aware of the banging on the windows, the men on the stairs trying to stop people getting in or out. I haven't seen anything that direct. But there is definitely still a lot of aggression and potential for violence from people who protest against women and women's events. I've never seen it as physically direct as that happened at that Women's Place event, but there's definitely a threat of it. And even at Filia in Glasgow, again, the police did reasonably well. They kept them across the road from the entrance. So they were shouting and aggressive and rude and sweary and all the rest of it to any of the women attending the conference. But the police kept them on the other side of the road. I know not all women's events have been as well policed. And there has been some horrendous events where you've seen women followed down the street, shouted at, surrounded by an angry, baying mob of trans activists, again with balaclavas and baseball caps and sunglasses, so they're dressed completely in black, really threatening and intimidating. And I know there has been, on occasion, in those sort of situations, some direct physical violence against women. But I've never been in any of those events where I've seen that, but I know it still happens. But it's not as commonplace as it was in the earlier days. I wouldn't say there's been a direct impact on family. Probably because it's a topic that we feel we can talk to each other about. My sister and I are maybe even closer than we would have been otherwise. Not that we weren't already close. There are family members that this is just a topic to avoid. But in order to preserve family relationships, it's a topic that's just avoided. I would say there are some friendships that are weaker, looser links now because of this subject. And there are definitely friendships that are a lot stronger because of this subject. But I've thankfully not been in a position where I've directly fallen out to non-speaking terms with either family or friends over this. Partly because professionally I remain neutral, visibly neutral. I'm not neutral, obviously, but professionally I appear to be neutral in terms of what I publish on this. So there's always that bit of me holding back unless I know I'm in a completely safe space or with safe people to be completely relaxed and be honest. So I'm able to just hold that bit back if I need to in order to maintain some friendships. I would say also, though, that of my friendship group, I don't know of anyone who's gone down the rabbit hole on trans activism, trans rights. So I've not personally been faced with someone who would feel strongly enough to be activist on the other side. But I'm grateful for that I've not been put in that situation. I know many, many women have. A huge network of wonderful women who I might never otherwise have met, and I've got some really, really lifelong friendships out of that. Honest, and that's for me absolutely primary. Secondary to that, but very important to me, is being able to really add value to this as a topic professionally, because I think it's so important for HR that we get it right. And we do have an obligation to be compliant with legislation in an HR role, which is far too often missed. But we do have that obligation. And for me, professionally, if the Supreme Court judgment had gone the other way, I'd have had to bite my tongue and keep any organisations that I support compliant with a judgment I didn't like and didn't want. And I would still have campaigned privately to get that changed. But I think that's the approach that as an HR professional you need to take. Regardless of your personal views, keep your organisations compliant. And if you then privately choose to campaign against or for a change in the law, fine, have at it. But recognise what the law is right here and right now in terms of professional position. I think too many people are still using Stonewall wish law rather than what is really clear from the Supreme Court. So the fact that I've been able to professionally add value to that and to this position as on this topic I've been really, really proud that we've been able to achieve what we've achieved. Unfortunately, I think it's going to come at the expense of more tribunals, more court challenges, more hard work, more fundraising and crowdfunding from women predominantly. And I know there are some men involved in this fight as well, and I know some men have suffered at work, but it is predominantly women. And I do think there's going to be more court challenges from Sex Matters, judicial reviews challenged by 4 Women Scotland, employment tribunals from women like Sandy Peggy. And where someone gets the strength to keep fighting in a tribunal like that, I don't know, because I know they're really draining. But it needs more, it's going to take more women holding organizations, holding governments to account for them to start complying with the law as it is. But we'll get there. Because we don't take no for an answer, do we? I don't have children. A lot of women involved in this have young children, not just grown up children, but young children, and have family responsibilities, and family life has to take priority, which means that there's less time to be involved and engaged in this. But I think whatever your family situation, women need time to step back and breathe without this for a while from time to time in order to have the strength to re-engage. And I think if someone goes quiet for months, weeks, or a year or whatever, we shouldn't put them down for that. Everyone has a different set of circumstances, different set of family situations and priorities. But even without that, women need to be able to draw breath and regroup internally and come back stronger. And I think we need to keep an eye on some other women in the, and I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but I think as a collective group of women fighting this, we also need to make sure that we're aware when some women are taking on too much or becoming stressed by it, and help some people to take a step back sometimes. I know for me, I needed to have a couple of months back from the work I was doing in Scene and HR, because it does become overwhelming, and you do start thinking about it every waking minute and waking up in the middle of the night thinking about it, and you need to take a step back from it sometimes and internally regroup and get the strength to go back at it again.
You've been listening to Unsilenced Project.